All right. So thank you, Trisha, for introducing us, and welcome everyone to um, learning about IEPs in today's session. So um, as Trish said, I am a family engagement coordinator at CISA One. I am also the parent of 4 adult sons. My oldest is 32. I have a 31-year-old and 2 28-year-olds. And so my 31-year-old does have a disability, had IEPs all the way 3 through 21. So I have lots of experience in navigating the school system. And I also have been a family engagement coordinator at CISA One through the Wisconsin Statewide Parent Educator Initiative grant for 18 years. So the presentation that we have here today is actually been developed by the Department of Public Instruction and the WSPEI grant. So just know that that information is general information, and I'm very thrilled to be presenting with Maria today because I have general information and Maria is going to make it real and applicable to you as parents of children that are either blind or visually impaired, as well as the school staff that work with them. So Trish had the PowerPoint and some handouts sent out to all of you. So you should all have a copy of the PowerPoint slides. And then we have a number of IEP forms. We have an actual sample IEP, and then an evaluation report, and then the notice of the IEP meeting. So, and then we also have agreement on IEP team meeting attendance at the IEP meeting. So just make sure you have your handouts there so that when we're hitting those parts of this presentation, you will then, we'll be referring to that. All right. So objectives. So what we're hoping to do in the next hour and 15 minutes is to define what an IEP is and the components of that IEP. We're going to talk about the steps in the IEP process and what the IEP team's roles are. And when we talk about IEP team roles, because we're talking about students that are blind and visually impaired, we've got added team members to the team, as well as what I'll be speaking to, having been a parent. I'll be speaking to the parents' role in the process and what's really important for parents to know what they can do and how they can participate. And then finally, we're going to share some resources with you so you'll hopefully know where to find and use IEP resources and websites. Oh, and then the other thing, Trish does have that great live binder too. So we've got some handouts and resources in there, much of what's been printed out here, as well as a few other things that we'll be referring to during this presentation. If you do have questions too, as we go along, please do ask those questions. We'll also have some time at the end to have a Q&A as well. All right, so this slide just in a nutshell puts it all together as far as what an IEP is and what it's not. So an IEP is a program of special education and related services that's very individualized and based on what the student's needs are. It's a legal commitment of resources and services. So what's in the IEP is what the school district or the local educational agency, the LEA, is committing to provide that student. And so oftentimes I have parents go to that when they call and they have questions or concerns. I always say, bring up your son or daughter's IEP and let's see what's written in there. Because what's written in there is what we can hold schools accountable to. It's a tool to measure the child's progress. I appreciate, over the years, I appreciated the fact that my son did have an IEP. I felt in many respects as a parent I knew more about where my son with an IEP was actually performing, what he could do, and what he struggled with, much more so than, for instance, my oldest son, who straight A student, got A's all the time, but what did that A really mean, right? So IEPs are really great tools to measure your child's progress. And that last bullet, it is changeable. So as your child changes, whether it's as they're learning more, as they're progressing, if they have setbacks from health or other ways, just know that it's just not one meeting a year. If things occur during the year, the IEP team can change it. What an IEP is not, it's not a daily lesson plan. It's not teacher-centered, and it's not a predetermined plan. Again, we should be looking at the specific needs of the child and building a program and around that child's needs, rather than saying, for instance, a child with autism goes in the autism classroom, because that's what we do with all kids in autism. That's not what an IEP is. It's individualized. So what steps happen before an IEP? So this is, I know, I think it was, I'm going to look at my notes here really quick. One of the parents who's on said that her child will have their first IEP coming up. That's very, very cool. Very exciting. I think it's exciting. But you're already in the birth to 3 system. So, but birth to 3 made that connection, or maybe you made that connection with the school district, and now the school district is now assuming that responsibility going through that IEP process. Sometimes families determine that their child is struggling and it's a new type of issue with their child. So a referral is what we call, is made when we suspect a child might have a disability and might be in need of special education. So when a referral is made, it's always in writing. It's always stating the reason why the individual making the referral feels the child is struggling. It says here the parent must be informed. That's because sometimes doctors, therapists, other people may make the referral for special education evaluation. And if that happens, there always is that linking back to make sure that the parent, who ultimately has the decision-making power, is informed that somebody made a referral for special education for this child. Oftentimes it's parents, though, that are making those referrals. Any questions about the referral process? Okay, I'm going to go on to the evaluation timeline. So we've made that referral. And so what happens then? So you'll see at the far left, a referral is received or notice initiating the evaluation. And then above the continuum, you'll see up to 15 business days. So you'll see here that the school has up to 15 business days. So that doesn't mean calendar days. So if I made a referral today, it would be 5 days next week, 5 days the next week after that, and then into that following week until I hit day 15. Okay, so it actually is business days. So when parents, for instance, make a referral right before Christmas break, the 15 business days, if it's the last day before before a break, Christmas break or spring break, the 15 business days are counted after break, after the kids come back, right? So during that 15 business days, the IEP team, the school begins a review of the existing data. So they might have some data on the student already, and they determine what types of information they have, and is that information good, and can it be used to make a decision about whether or not the child has a disability and whether or not that child needs special education specially designed instruction and services. Oftentimes that data isn't strong enough or isn't enough. And so during that time, the school is identifying what types of additional assessments do we need to perform in order to make that decision as to whether or not the student qualifies. So a consent for additional assessments gets sent to a parent that will list out all of the different types of assessments that the school district will do in order to make that determination of whether or not the student is eligible for special education and whether or not they need special education services. So that consent typically will come out before the 15 business days. Most school districts do a pretty decent job of moving right through that. And then the parent at that time can sit on that consent. I always recommend that parents review the consent form, and if they're okay with everything that's being evaluated and assessed, sign it, send it back. And then from there, the receipt of the parent's consent for additional assessment, that's right here, starts the 60 calendar day timeline. So we have 60 calendar days. So during that time, the school personnel, school staff, are doing the assessments and testing and collecting data during that time. And within that 60 days, there's going to be scheduled a determination of eligibility meeting, an IEP meeting. And that's where everybody comes together, shares all their assessments. And that's where the actual decision as to whether or not the student qualifies under one of the categories of disability. And number two, due to that disability, does the student require special education in order to receive and to access an education? Sometimes students are found to be eligible as far as having a disability, but not eligible for special education. Sometimes that does happen, but it has to happen at this determination of eligibility or an IEP meeting. If the IEP team, if the people around the table say yes to both questions, the child does qualify for a disability under one of these categories and does need specially designed instruction and services and supports, then an IEP is written. And then up to 30 calendar days may occur where that development of the IEP is made, placement is determined, and then the IEP is implemented. So that's how long the evaluation timeline for an initial evaluation could be for a student. I find oftentimes school districts do move through this process much quicker than the 115 or 105 days that are shown here. At the bottom of this continuum, you'll notice that the same steps occur, but sometimes when a school team here identifies we've got all this existing data and we don't need any additional data, right below here, this big area. So when you don't need any additional data, you can move into that determination of eligibility, because let's say there's just an overwhelming amount of data available that to make that determination of special education is already there and there's no need. That doesn't happen very often, but it does happen on occasion. Any questions about the evaluation timeline? Or Maria, did you want to pop in at this time?
The one thing I was just going to say is that this is a very helpful resource if you're ever wondering, like, how often, how much time do I have? All of these timelines and things you can find on the DPI website. So if you search Wisconsin evaluation timeline and special ed, there will be a link. If you forget anything, you can always look it up, and Wisconsin Department of Instruction has a lot of their resources available just as a Google, simple Google search, and you can find it. So it's so much appreciated that it's in here, but you can also find it in other ways as well.
Great. Thank you, Maria.
Mhm.
All right. So we're going to go on to the next step now. So who's on the IEP team? Well, of course, we have parents as at the top, and parents, you are a part of that IEP team from beginning to end. Any decisions made in regard to eligibility, in regard to placement, in regard to services, you are part of that team. And I strongly encourage you to attend every IEP team meeting. And if you're not able to attend, ask if it could be rescheduled, if there's an ability to do that, as long, or if there's another way that you can participate. This year, a lot of IEP team meetings were done virtually. Some drawbacks with that, but it also, I think, made scheduling easier as well. So I think plenty of opportunities there, but parents are always part of the team. Also, the general education teacher, you'll always have to have somebody who is familiar with the curriculum that students, whatever age the student is, what they would be learning and knowing and what the curriculum is. You always have a special ed teacher or provider. You don't get an IEP unless you're getting special education. So a provider could be a speech, because sometimes our kids have only speech and language as a disability. So sometimes it may be a speech and language pathologist or teacher that would be part of this IEP team. We also have a local education agency representative. That's the LEA, one of those acronyms. And that's someone that is qualified to really provide and supervise special education, knows about general ed, is knowledgeable, and is authorized to commit LEA resources. And what we mean by LEA resources is typically funding to support different types of things that the student might need in their IEP, as well as staff. If there are changes in the IEP and there would be some reason why there would be additional need of the student identified, you need to have somebody there who's that representative to say yay or nay to what's being proposed. Someone who explains the evaluation results, and this could be an LEA representative or a special ed teacher. Others with knowledge or expertise, so these could be other staff in the school. It could be people that the parent invites, and I know lots of parents invite their child's therapists. Sometimes their child's aunt or uncle or grandparent. Sometimes parents invite advocates. So just know that parents have the ability to invite others that have knowledge or expertise. Always though, always tell the school in advance who you're inviting. You can also have service providers from other agencies that might come. And those might be invited by the school or might be invited by you, the parent. If the school invites any outside agencies, they do have to seek permission from the parent to invite those outside agencies, because bringing someone in who isn't in the educational system, the school, inviting them in, the school is then informing that person that this child has a disability. And due to confidentiality, the law is very clear that school staff have to make sure they seek the parent's consent. And then finally, the child. Having your child at an IEP meeting is a wonderful way to really keep the focus on the student, to build upon, to build that student's sense of self-determination, self-advocacy, self-esteem. And as the child gets older, we like to see the student actually sometimes running the IEP and kind of taking major portions of it, which is really empowering. So, but typically children, starting them just for a few minutes to come into an IEP meeting and get to know who's all there and to talk a little bit about themselves, what they like about school, what they don't like. Those types of things, it's really powerful. And then finally, when students are 14 to 21, it's not uncommon to have transition related agencies that are from the adult world, Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, employment agencies, and such may be invited as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Maria.
All right, thank you. So a couple things, I'm just going to draw your attention to the papers that you have received. So one of the things I want to mention is that the sample IEP that you were sent is from the program called Infinite Campus. There are, I think, around 10-ish student information systems that different schools and districts use around the state. So this is the one that we use at the School for the Blind in Janesville. And so that's what this was created with. The paperwork will look different from system to system. It might have different orders, but the content of the paperwork is still going to be there in some form. So the first paper that you would look at that you would receive probably is going to be your invite. So the invite that you have, it would say, dear parent or guardian, and then it has some check boxes and it tells you when the meeting is. So what I've done with this sample IEP is anytime there was check boxes, I tried to put some stars and then describe what the check boxes are for, and then give just a little explanation. Some of those areas are limited by space and how much I could put in them. To give you just an idea of what an IEP would look like and what you might see. So like Cheri said, so the people who would be coming to this IEP, so a student with a visual impairment would also very likely have a teacher of the visually impaired. So it might be abbreviated TVI, TBVI. So there's a couple different abbreviations, but TVI is the most common in the state of Wisconsin that I've seen. They also might have an O&M, so orientation and mobility. Other providers that we have seen on other providers we've seen in meetings are occupational therapy, physical therapy, music therapy, and then Cheri had mentioned speech and language. So all of those people would be somebody that you might see on this invite. And then you would also see those people on your IEP itself. There's going to be a team meeting cover page, and then all of those people will also be listed. So on the sample IEP, when you get to the meeting, so you get the invitation first, and then you go to the IEP, and you'll get a lot of times a draft IEP, or they'll look at the IEP and be developing it while you're there. And then in that, you'll have the same thing. You'll have that same list of who they are, and it'll say whether they were invited or not invited. When you're talking about people who are at the meeting, at one of the other papers that we have is permission on attendance. So it's agreement on team meeting participant. So at the beginning of every meeting, I usually go through and introduce everybody who's there. And then if there's somebody who's not there, then I would ask the parent, do you give permission to go ahead without this person? Especially if you didn't know that they were going to be absent from the meeting ahead of time, things come up, so it's not uncommon for that to happen. Or if someone's going to come in somebody else's place. So one of your regular ed teachers was sick and another regular ed teacher is filling in for the meeting. And then you just ask permission. So that's what I have documented on there. So a lot of times with a virtual IEP meeting, you might have that. And so I would say, this permission was given verbally, and we note that there was a different person attending. So we note that someone was approved to attend and also someone is approved to be excused. Does anybody have any questions or anything about the IEP team, or this is a small group, so I have no problem if you want to unmute and ask a question at any time. Otherwise, if you want to put them in the chat, either way.
I had just mentioned a question in the chat. If you could just touch a little bit for the parents who might be here about what happens if there's a divorce and you have a step parent and not the biological parent, and who has legal rights to be there. I've had IEPs where just the step parent came, or the step mom came, but not the biological dad. And so there was always some confusion on who could get that and that information. If you could just touch on that.
So Cheri, you might have a little more experience with that than I do. But I know, so the parent can invite people, and I've had some experiences where the parent has given permission for the step parent to attend. And so legally, as long as if the parent wasn't there and then they have given their permission, we've talked ahead of the meeting that the step parent was there. But I haven't had too many situations, thankfully, where there's been a divorce or there's been any disagreements about who's legally there. A lot of times in a district, there's a primary parent, and that's who a district would go to first. And so they would share the information with that person first, and then I would say that you would be setting up the meeting with that person and then following through with your secondary contact. But step parents have to they have to have permission. Cheri?
Correct. When there is divorce and there are step parents, it becomes really, really tricky. But according to IDEA, biological parents are the ones that have the procedural safeguards and the parents' rights. So a lot of school districts that I've worked with, when they've had these situations where maybe mom and dad aren't getting along and that type of thing. And so sometimes school districts, they're like, so would you recommend just talking with the one parent or not? And really both parents have the right. And so I have a lot of school districts that will communicate to both families, attempt to schedule things in working with both families, and those step parents are not legally invited. Okay, so it's only the parents. And I've had situations where there had to be some like agreements, I will say, outside the meeting, kind of setting the stage for whether or not the step parents could be there, and if they were there, what their roles were. And it can get really, really tricky. But ultimately, it's mom and dad, the biological parents. Unless this is an adoptive situation, then the adoptive parents would have the legal rights. Foster parents, oh, that's a whole different ballgame there too. But there's a lot of information on the DPI website in regard to that situation. So I encourage school districts to work with both parents, unless there's something, if there's a court order that prevents one parent from participating for one reason or another. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I just encourage parents to push aside your differences. A couple of years ago, I worked with a couple. They were divorced, and dad would talk to me and talk about all the things about mom. Mom would talk to me and talk about all the things about dad. And I kept saying, I really don't care. I want to know about the boy, the child. And we need to come together and talk about the child, and you got to leave your baggage at the door. It's not always doable, but we are here together because of the child.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tricky situation. All right. So I'm going to move on. So this talks about some new language, and this occurred back in 2017. The IEP forms were revised, and so there was new language added. Things were shifted a little bit. The law didn't change, but how DPI, the Department of Public Instruction in Wisconsin, looks at IEPs has changed. So number one, instead of just an individualized education program, an IEP, we're now calling them College and Career Ready, the CCR IEP. That's because we need to be working and focused that these IEPs are being written with the idea that the child will continue to make progress, and one day be college, career, and there should be another C word in there called community ready for when they leave high school at the age of 18, 19, 20, or 21, however long the student stays. Students are allowed to stay till age 21, but that's so that's our focus. So number one, that's the first change. We also have a change that the federal government said schools, well, I should say states, have not been closing the gap with students with disabilities. And so they put in place what's called results-driven accountability. So they are now holding states accountable for closing the achievement gap between students with disabilities and without disabilities. And in the state of Wisconsin, every state had to choose. So what kind of results are you going to measure to determine whether or not that achievement gap is closing? A lot of states across the United States chose attendance or graduation. In the state of Wisconsin, we chose to focus on reading. So you'll see reading drives achievement, success through literacy, RDA, STL. And you'll notice in the IEPs, there are a number of places that as we go through the process, you'll see that we address reading and we ask, how does the student's disability impact reading? Okay, so those were the changes, and that's what this slide is about. So more acronyms. All right. The other thing about this is DPI also kind of developed a framework by which they want IEP teams to work. And so number one, they want IEP teams to really explore their attitudes and beliefs regarding students with disabilities. Some parents may feel that because your child has a disability, sometimes people have lower expectations for our children. And we need to change that attitude and belief. And so the CCR IEP really wants people to take a look at what our child's strengths are and leveraging those strengths to address some of the challenges. DPI also wants IEP teams to build knowledge and skills in order to evaluate and plan for special ed services. We need to sharpen our knowledge and sharpen our skills to help students move from where they are right now to be college and career ready. And then finally, they wanted school systems to really examine their systems and practices for which they support students and their families and educators. So really looking at how do we provide services to students in our schools? Do we keep them in a separate classroom, or do we include students in general ed classes, and do they have access to the general ed curriculum? So all those things were built around this new framework. Along with that new framework came 5 beliefs. So the 5 beliefs are: number one, high expectations. That all students have abilities, and that we should not have low expectations for students with disabilities, but actually expect that student to one day maybe have a job, maybe go to college, to live on their own. So we need to set our expectations high, and that means everyone on the IEP team That's from the parents to the educators to everyone else. Number 2, culturally responsive practices. That means being aware of the student's way of being, where they come from, what their family's beliefs and values are about, and taking into consideration that all students are not the same. Students are different, families are different, and so we need to be responsive. And so culturally responsive practices is another belief. Number 3, student relationships. What we mean by that is student to student relationships, that we need to think about how students interact and how students with disabilities engage with students without disabilities, but also student relationships. We're talking about student relationships from the adult to the student perspective as well. So does a student with a disability have relationships with the adults, teachers, and staff in the school as well? Item number 4 is family and community engagement. That means having us at the table as parents, and that we are necessary in order for students to become college and career ready, okay? Students spend only 15–20% of their time in school. The other part of the time, they're at home, they're in the community. And so we have a lot to do in impacting students. And then finally, collective responsibility, meaning that it's everyone's responsibility to lift up our kids, to educate our kids, to support our kids with disabilities. It's not just the special ed teacher or the teacher of the blind and visually impaired's responsibility. It's everyone's. And then finally, the next informational slide here, there is a 5-step process. It's always been in the law, this 5-step, but when DPI revamped things in 2017, they did some re-emphasizing, I guess. So step 1, understanding achievement. Step 2, once you know where the student is at, you identify the effects of the disability. Once you identify the effects and what the disability related needs are, you develop goals to address those needs, and you align services. You provide accommodations and related services and special ed, and then you analyze progress. And you continue through that process each and every time as you develop an IEP or as you revise an IEP every year. All right, so that's kind of the overview, kind of the nuts and bolts of what's involved in the IEP process. So now we're going to go into each one of the steps. And as we go through each of the steps, we'll just highlight what happens in each step. And we'll also talk a little bit about ways that parents might be involved in that particular step. So the first one is step 1, understanding achievement. So this is that first page. Typically, it's a long written narrative, right? About what our student is good at, what our child is good at, what their strengths and interests are. And we want to talk about those first. We talk about academic content areas. So we start thinking about and reporting out on how well do they read, how well do they do math, their written language. We may talk about social studies, science. We may talk about Phy-Ed, things like that. So we all those academic area content. For preschoolers, you'll see here, we really address knowledge and skills such as early language development, communication, literacy, cognition, and general knowledge. So, so it's really, and we're hoping at this point, not only do we have a narrative, but we also have data that's being included in the present level that'll give us a really good solid idea of where the student is performing right now. So that as we develop IEP, as we develop the goals throughout the IEP, we're working on information that is current, okay? So data from this year.
So in that packet that you received, so where the present level would be in this IEP is on page 3. And so the strengths are usually listed under letter A, and then the academic and functional performance as letter B. And so numbers 1 and 2. So one of the things that might also be included in that academic performance is your recent state or district assessments. So if your student is being tested using any of the district assessments, like a STAR test or anything that is documenting their growth over the year. Sometimes those are done twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year. It depends on the district. And then also as they get older, they'll participate in state assessments that'll happen, and then those might be included there. Sometimes when a student is learning, especially if they have a visual impairment and they're learning to read Braille along with learning to read as a print reader would, some teachers might include some of the Braille present levels in that area, only because it also involves their reading skills. So they may, if someone has recently lost vision, they might want to include where their reading level is, what their reading level is as a person who had vision before, and then now what their reading level is as a Braille reader, because those really do make an impact. But then Braille would also be listed under the functional, which Cheri's going to talk about next, is because that's part of the ECC skills. And I'll say a little bit about that after she talks about this next slide.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria.
Mhm.
Yeah. So this is the second part of the present level, is the functional performance. And so in the functional performance, we talk about activities and non-academic skills needed for independence, access to instruction and performance in school, in the home, and in the community, for leisure. So those are all those other types of things that could very well impact a student's access to instruction. And again, for preschoolers, we look at positive social emotional skills. We look at use of appropriate behaviors to meet their needs and acquisition and use of knowledge. And then we also look at skills such as early language and communication. Maria?
So what's listed underneath that functional performance is the expanded core curriculum. So those are the areas that students with visual impairment need more instruction in, because they're things that you might learn from observation that they just need more explicit instruction. Like the mail carrier, yes, he delivers mail, but he has to drive to your house. He has to put the mail in a bag. He has to walk up to your house. He has to put so they know, kids learn the certain jobs, but they need to know what steps, because people don't always describe what they're doing. Or a bank teller, like what a job a bank teller might do, adding the money and putting it in the computer and putting it in an envelope. They don't know all those steps, those things that they need to learn by more instruction than just observing. So those areas include orientation and mobility, assistive technology, daily living skills, or it's also known as independent living skills, sensory efficiency, compensatory skills, and that may be where you'll find the Braille listed, and then self-determination, social skills, career education, and recreation and leisure. So those are skills that your TVI, your O&M, those staff members would help you address each time. And they vary. It's not, when your child is 3, they're going to have some things. They may not be so focused on career education when they're 3, but when they're 21, they will be. And so those areas come in different times. So you might be really focused on orientation and mobility right away, and then you learn quite a few skills, and then you back off a little bit because you're at a place where you're not learning to travel independently to Florida, but you have learned how to navigate your high school, you've learned how to navigate your middle school. So it just depends on where you are as to what those skills would need. But then those additional service areas would also be listed under there: speech and language, OT, PT, music therapy, and then any nursing needs. Some students need private duty nursing, or they have more complex health needs, and then they might have to just document it with a statement there that a student needs more assistance during the day, and a private duty nurse is helping them. Thanks, Cheri.
This is awesome, Maria. And so I love what you've put in here and really helped people understand all the different types of information that could be shared and written about a student to really help the IEP team as a whole really know where that student is at, where they're performing, how well they're doing, so that as a team, you can make some really good, solid decisions about where to take the student next. This is also an area where families can share information as well. So if you were part of the Navigating Special Ed Resources Session 1 in January, in the live binder, or at that one, I had shared the student snapshot and the My Snapshot. Those are included in this session as well. There's a tab in the live binder, and I think at the end, we'll just feature those and show those at that time. But if families fill out that information about their child, you know, what are your child's strengths? What are those proud moments about your child? What are the things that you notice at home? Those types of things are really important, and they can contribute and they can fill in and make that really complete picture under the present level here. Okay. Whoops. Let's go. All right. So now we come to special factors, and the special factors is still in step 1. So we're still talking about what types of information do we need to talk about and consider before we even start talking about disability related needs and things like that. So this here, these 5 areas have always been here. So behavior, and this is a summary of the student's behavior and how it impedes their learning and or learning of others. So sometimes we have to think about, does the student have a behavioral intervention plan? Does the student have any particular needs? And if the student does, you're going to check yes, and then you're going to indicate some information there. If they don't, then you're going to say no. We also address English language learners. So does the student, is their first language something other than English? There's blind and visually impaired, which I'm going to have Maria talk about. There's also communication. So does the student have any particular communication needs that impede the student's learning? And then assistive technology is the 5th one. And this is one of 3 areas in the IEP where assistive technology can show up. And this is where we would address any devices or services the child might need to assist with reading, it says here, but actually it's with everything. But just remember that IEPs are now addressing reading in multiple areas. So you'll see the word reading pop up periodically. Maria?
All right, so the special factors is on page 4. So the things I would add for that is the behavior. So if we were to say there was a behavior that we were concerned about, you may have had a functional behavior assessment completed. So if there's a behavior that's impeding learning, you know, they would do a functional behavior assessment, and then you'd also find a behavior intervention plan. So those are 2 more acronyms that you might find, FBA and BIP. And then under the English language learner, so it says EL on this one. So some people have seen it as ELL, some people see it as ESL, some people see it as EL. So those are common acronyms that go together. But students who are English language learners also would take an access test. So then those scores might be documented in there, just documenting how that affects it. But for students who have ESL services or EL services, those would be documented in another document because that is separate from the IEP. Here is, are they and how does it affect their special education? But in the for an English language learner, you would have a separate documentation that talks about those services because those are separate. And then so for Braille, so there is an ER3 that you received a copy of. So that is something that is done with your evaluation that is done every 3 years. So the evaluation report would say what the Braille needs are, and then you would this would be attached to the IEP, just documenting that. But most often your student is going to have goals related to Braille and then still continue to receive Braille instruction. And then sorry, I turned to my page. And then number 5, where they're talking about assistive technology, that's a list of things that your student might use, not when they use it, but it's just a list. So it could include many different things. It could include a Braille, or it could include dark line paper. Assistive technology is very simple and very complex. So a highlighter to a refreshable Braille display, there's a wide scale of that, but then also the accessible educational materials. So the formats that the student would need, whether they need large print, Braille, or audio, or electronic texts, so things like that.
Great. Thanks, Maria.
Yep.
All right. So the last part of step 1 is the concerns of the parent and family. So there is a section following Item 5 under special factors, concerns of the parents and family, that allows you as a parent and the student also to put statements in here in regard to their concerns. And so this is, and I kind of cringe when they put the concerns in here. It would have been nice just to say input from parents and student, but parents have input in the other parts of the present level. And it's kind of fitting, excuse me. I think the reason why DPI decided to have the concerns here is in the next section, we actually start rolling into addressing the effects of the disability. I apologize. I'm recovering from a cold, so this is par for the course. It's amazing I went this far without coughing. All right, so we got through step 1. Step 2, this is where we look at the effects of the disability. And so this is where the team will actually determine if and describe how the student's disability actually adversely affects his or her progress toward meeting grade level reading standards, as well as other areas that are affected. And for preschoolers, we're looking at the Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards for language development, communication, and early literacy. So while again, in the IEP form, it's really saying, so how does the child's disability adversely affect his or her progress toward in reading? But we're looking at all areas. As we do that, oh, go ahead. Sorry about that.
I apologize. That's
No.
okay. I apologize. My dog was barking and I was trying to wait till he was done.
Okay.
So, but on the effects of the disability, I just wanted to mention sometimes, unfortunately, it can be framed in a negative way, or people perceive it as a negative way because you're comparing a student to their same age peers. And we want to look at what they can do, not what they can't do. And so if you're looking at it, just be prepared that sometimes it just needs rewording. You want to reword it with an open mind and look at what they can do, not what they can't.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because we do have, no matter what student it is, we're always first assuming the student will participate in the general ed curriculum. But also, as it says here, some students that have more significant cognitive disabilities may actually participate in an alternative achievement standard. So we have the state standards, but we also have the essential elements. So that's an alternative standard achievement standard that's aligned to the state standards in reading and math and things like that. So just know we're always looking at the general ed curriculum and what those standards are and trying to work towards them, because remember, we're calling these college and career ready IEPs, and we're trying to have those high expectations and including students with their same age peers. And Maria, you're right, it is hard. I have my son has a significant cognitive disability. So he's 31, but reading and math wise, he's about a 5-year-old. So those conversations for us as parents are really, really hard the older the student gets, because you realize the gap keeps getting larger and larger. And how could my son or daughter ever be able to participate in the general ed curriculum? But there are ways to do that. And you really do have to look at their strengths, what they're good at, and work at developing that. Because not every job requires you to be able to read at a 6th grade level. And so there's a lot of things that are sometimes more important, like being able to work with people rather than being able to do calculus. Having those soft skills sometimes become more important. So as we go through this, here's an example of a root cause analysis, because when the IEP team gets together and they're saying, so how does the student's disability affect their ability to read, or how does it affect their ability in any part of school or in any part of life? What we look at first is the IEP team actually observes the student, and through that observation then tries to determine why is the student not able to do something, right? So we're focusing on something that's a challenge, because that's why the student has an IEP to begin with. There is a disability that impacts, and so what do we observe? So in this example, the IEP team observed that the student does not independently read grade level text. So the team says, well, why do we think that happens? Well, they say the student gets frustrated when required to read independently, when the text read aloud or using a text reader he can't access and comprehend. Well, why is that? Well, he has trouble gaining meaning from grade level written material when reading independently. Well, why is he having trouble gaining meaning? Well, his reading fluency is insufficient to efficiently read grade level written material on his own. Well, why isn't his reading fluency sufficient enough? Well, because the student has difficulty with decoding, which affects his fluency and makes it hard to read and to understand text. Well, why does the student have difficulty with decoding? Because the student has difficulty with their basic phonological skills, which affects decoding. So they went through that analysis, and sometimes they say you should ask why at least 5 times. I think sometimes you can ask why 3 times or 1 time, and you might get to what you believe that root cause is. In this case, they identified 2 disability-related needs. Number 1, the phonological and decoding skills. So that was at the bottom there. But number 2, another disability-related need that the IEP team said, you know what, I think this is something we might want to address, is it might be helpful if we help the student develop some skills and use some strategies to reduce the frustration that he or she feels. And that way it'll improve their ability to engage in reading and activities. So this is just an example. This example was provided by DPI. So I don't know if they had a real student that they utilized this, but this example is there just to demonstrate how we should be asking why. So we understand, what is it that we have to put in the IEP? What goal, what skill do we have to help the student develop so that they can do reading or that they can do whatever it is. So we're looking at trying to uncover the skill that we need to work on. This slide just kind of puts it all together, how disability related needs identifies the why the student. So we just identified those disability related needs, the two of them. So we're identifying those. We're then linking those disability related needs to writing goals or services. So you don't necessarily have to have a goal for every need, because some needs may be addressed as an accommodation or a service on the IEP summary page and may not necessarily be a goal. So an example of that might be allowing, the student has difficulty traveling from class to class, especially middle school, high school students, because there's so far of a distance between classes that maybe that student has that difficulty and has a need that needs to be addressed there. And that wouldn't be necessarily a skill to teach the student how to walk, because maybe they know how to walk, but maybe they need some extra time. And so it would be an accommodation. They would be allowed to leave 5 minutes early before the end of class so that they could travel through the building, get to their next class before the hundreds of other students come out, and there's no way to navigate that system. So you wouldn't have a goal, but you would have a service or an accommodation that would allow that student to address that need to get from class to class within an amount of time and in a safe way. All
so
right.
an example of those needs in the sample IEP is on page 6. So a need, we just want to make sure that they're structured. So that the number 1 was how a need was structured. And so you have to have a minimum of at least 1 need in each IEP. And then, but it would be structured. So the student needs to increase something to do something. So you need them to be able to do something to get somewhere, to do something. And so that's how you'd want them to be structured. And then, so there's just an example of what an orientation and mobility need might look like following that.
Very cool. And then right underneath the disability related needs, there is a family engagement prompt. And this was added. We're the only state in the United States that has IEP forms that includes a family engagement prompt. And here is where the school will identify, school staff will identify how they will engage parents or families in the education of the student. And there's a variety of different examples from sharing resources to connecting families to learning activities and other types of things that are in here. So all right. The next section is step 3 on goals, and the goals address a disability related need. So you can't have a goal unless it's addressing a disability related need. So it links it back to step 2. And this includes a skill set that the team determines the student must develop. You always identify a baseline. So you take whatever information you shared early on in the present level about where the student is currently performing. That's included in here. A level of attainment is included in here. So in 1 year from now, by the end of this IEP, where do we think as an IEP team, what is our best guess where the student will be in a year from now? And it's only a best guess, okay? No one has a crystal ball that knows for sure where that student will be, but what do we want to work toward? It also addresses how this goal will be measured. So we ask the question, what will the student do, where and when, and to what level and degree, okay? So we want to know how it will be measured. We want to know how and when the parents will be informed of progress. And then annual goals. Some of our annual goals may have short-term objectives and or benchmarks that are included. And so it just all, it all depends. And
Cheri?
Yep, go ahead.
I'm
Go
hop
ahead.
in for just a second. So when we talk about the annual goals, so in the sample IEP that you have, like I mentioned earlier, this is just one out of many. So this was an Infinite Campus one, and they can be structured however the team decides. So in an IEP like this, annual goals have to be reviewed every year. So if this was an IEP that was not the first one, you would review your annual goals. And so in this sample, you have the review of the annual goals that just talks about how they did last year, because when you're thinking about how they'll do in a year, so then they talk about what the progress they made, whether the goal was met or not met, and if it wasn't met, why was it not met, and how are they going to address it in the next cycle. So that is on page 7, and then the examples of the goals would be on page 9. When they do have to have short-term objectives or benchmarks is when, like Cheri mentioned, if your student is on learning with alternate achievement standards or taking the alternate assessment, they must have the short-term objectives. They have to have at least 2. Oh, and that's her next slide.
And these are such excellent examples. I really appreciate you going through this, Maria, and putting this in here, because this is really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for the parents that are on today as well. And as Maria had said, for students with more significant disabilities that are taking that alternative assessment and that are in that alternative curriculum as well, benchmarks are required. Short-term objectives are, well, either or, short-term objectives or benchmarks need to be in there as well. So yeah. All right. And then I have an example here. These are examples from our grant and from DPI. And so as you'll see here, Dan will take that first one. Dan will apply decoding strategies to improve his reading fluency of 4th grade passages to 90 words read correctly per minute with 90% comprehension. So that's our goal, okay? And so now what we would see in the IEP forms, if it was in an IEP, we have that Dan will apply decoding strategies to improve his reading fluency of 4th grade passages. We've got baseline data. So this, in the original IEP, which was a sample IEP we used years ago, this is what was in the present level. So currently Dan reads 95 words per minute at a 2nd grade level, which is his independent level. 4th grade level, he only reads 55 words per minute read correctly with only 75% comprehension. So significantly less at his 4th grade level compared to his independent reading level, which is at 95, but it's a 2nd grade. So we've got information in here. Also with baseline, we also usually include information about what is expected. So remember, we always refer back to the general ed curriculum, right? So students in 4th grade are expected to read passages with 90 to 100% comprehension at a rate of 120 to 150 words per minute. So it's important to know where his peers normally are at, knowing where Dan is at currently based on his present level and knowing where students are at. So you have both those pieces of information. So then the IEP team then says, okay, so let's think a year from now, we're going to see Dan. We're hoping Dan can go from 55 words read per minute to 90. Right now he's 75% comprehension. We're hoping to get him up to 90% of 4th grade passages. So that's what they're hoping for to do in the next year. Knowing he'll still be behind, right? But going from 55 to 90 is pretty significant, right? So So that's a high expectation. We're pushing Dan, and that's what we want to see. We want to think about, you know, how far can we push him, and not have low expectations. And then we also indicate no benchmarks or short-term objectives. Dan's in the regular ed curriculum. We'll take the standard tests and assessments just like all other students. And we address what annual goals, disability-related needs are being addressed by this annual goal. We then go on to say, so how are we going to measure progress? Well, we're going to do weekly timed oral readings where Dan's use of decoding strategies is recorded, and we're going to log observations about Dan's reading of classroom materials. So that's the procedure. So I, as a parent, know what to expect. So I know what the school staff are going to be collecting. And then how often are they going to let me know as a parent how well Dan is doing? This IEP team said, well, this is a really important goal. And I as a parent want to hear from the school a little bit more often than just when report cards are provided. So, and that sometimes happens. Some of the goals, depending upon what it is, parents might want to know more often how well the student is doing, especially if the parent is working with the school to help that parent support that, or to help the school by supporting their child at home in reading, for instance. A lot of us parents help our children at home, right? And so maybe there needs to be a little bit more communication in regard to that, okay? But most IEPs that I see, the reports about progress on annual goals is usually when the other report cards come home. So that's normal. All right. Maria, anything else to add here?
Really want to. But my dog is there. There is a question in the chat.
Okay. So, Julie, do you just want to say it or should I?
No, if you could, just because my kids are being...
Right. Okay. Okay. My son is 4 and has an IEP that does have does or doesn't have benchmarks?
Does.
Does have benchmarks or short-term objectives. Does that mean he's on an alternative academic track?
No, it doesn't always mean that. And so I will say some goals are so big. So if we did Dan's second goal, which is a writing goal, we didn't do that one as an example. Dan's in the regular ed curriculum, but Dan's writing goal, if I go back just to talk about this a little bit. So I go to the first page, read this goal. Dan will write a paragraph of at least 5 8 to 10 word sentences with no more than 1 error in spelling and punctuation after editing. There are so many things going on here. Writing a paragraph, at least 5 8 to 10 word sentences. There's also, he's going to have to do editing. And he also, there were like 4 benchmarks that were written under this goal. So if you ever, I think I could pull it out, Julie, if you wanted me to ever show you an example, I could do that sometime. But that is an example of a goal that has so many pieces to it that it makes it really hard to measure that goal. So sometimes breaking down a goal into parts makes it easier to, number one, work on the specific skills within that goal. Okay. It also makes it easier to measure, because writing a sentence or writing a paragraph of 5 8 to 10 word sentences is one thing, but then there was after editing. So we're going to probably measure Dan's when he edits, that'll be a different measure. And so it'll take multiple ways of addressing that goal. So sometimes goals can have short-term objectives and benchmarks. They're only required for students that are in an alternative curriculum and will take an alternative assessment. But they can be included on every single goal as well. So it all depends. And so as a parent, and I'm really glad you asked this question too, Julie, because that's something that parents need to feel like they can ask. Ask the question, is my child part of the general ed curriculum? Or does my child work on an alternative curriculum? Because you are right, it does have an impact on whether or not that child will go to college and that type of thing. It will have an impact in some school districts. It may have an impact as to whether or not the child receives a diploma or a certificate of attendance or a certificate of completion. So those questions are really, really important, but ask at your IEP meeting. So what curriculum is my son or daughter accessing? Is it the general ed curriculum? And for 4-year-olds, we're looking at WMLS, so Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards. And then once they hit kindergarten, there's a little bit of an overlap between WMLS and the core, the standards. So excellent question. All right. So step 4, aligning services program, the program summary. So this is where we start talking about the services and support that are going to be written into the IEP that will help that student work towards those goals that we just identified. And we include with every service frequency and amount. So how much and how often will it occur, the location, the duration, and we identify which disability related need is being addressed, as well as the goal. So there are 4 types. We're going to talk about supplementary aids and services, specially designed instruction and special ed, related services, and then the program modifications and supports for school personnel.
And these will start on page 12 of that sample IEP.
Excellent. Yeah, this is the fun stuff. I love reading this part of the IEP and this is probably the area that I will say, parents oftentimes believe that their child is getting certain services and supports. And this is the area that I have families go to, read to me what's in there. Because sometimes we understand based on our conversation in the IEP meeting that certain things were going to be written into the IEP that we're going to be provided, but we don't always go back and really take a good look at what actually made it into the IEP. Okay, so that's really important. So I always refer families back to this. So the first one, supplementary aids and services. So these are the types of things that will allow your child to stay in the general ed curriculum and be educated with their non-disabled peers. So that's why this is first, because we want to see if there are things that we can do in the regular ed classroom to help the student participate in the general ed curriculum and not have to be pulled out and not have to receive additional specially designed instruction and things like that. So you see a whole list of different examples here that I offer up to you on this slide. And Maria, do you want to talk about this section now?
Sure.
Okay.
So supplementary aids and services so in the sample, so the first one that I have listed there, it says accessible instructional material. And then I just have how that would be formatted. They can address a goal. They have to address a need. So some of them on your IEP might say it addresses goals 4 and 5, goals 1 and 2, but they don't have to. The second one I have is instruction accommodations and modifications. So this is more of an example. So this particular example says audio material will be provided daily, both in-person and virtual instruction when large amounts of reading are required. So these are where in that list and that special factors that we talked about earlier, the list is in the special factors, but here is where you're going to find when is it being used, and how is it being used? And then one of the things that have happened a lot with the IEPs in this past year, while many students are virtual, is the location is different. So sometimes it might say a special education classroom in person. Sometimes it might say when you're virtual. And so that might be more specific. Each district has a little bit of different way to indicate what would happen if they were virtual at that time, but it's going to be laid out in this. And then the same thing would be true for the other services as well. The location may look different for each thing. It may, you know, for O&M, it might be the community, but while you're virtual, your community is not the same, you know, but for Braille instruction, it would be a classroom and then a virtual classroom, so that you may not have much of a difference.
Excellent. The next section is specially designed instruction. So this is actual content, methodology, or delivery of instruction to address the unique needs of the student with a disability. And this is always taught by a special ed teacher or OT, PT, somebody with a license to work with students and provide specially designed instruction, except when we're talking about reading. Actually, the law changed a few years ago that said a licensed reading teacher may also provide specially designed instruction. Maria.
Mm-hmm. So under specially designed instruction, so an example that I have there is just ECC skills instruction. So that expanded core curriculum is commonly abbreviated as ECC. So your TVI might see your student once a week, twice a week. It depends. Again, when we talk about what their needs are at this time, they're not traveling to Florida, but they might be traveling in high school. They are learning to read the alphabet in Braille, or they've already got the alphabet down, but now they're going into chemistry and they need to learn more about scientific notation and things like that. So depending on their needs, this may change, and your team would discuss that, and all of your minutes and such would be approved by your team.
All right. Next section is related services. So these are services that are required by the student to benefit from special education. And so you see the examples on here. Maria.
And so the related services, so there was a couple OT staff that are with us. So an OT might come in and work directly with a student one time a week, once a month. You know, their times may vary. I wouldn't be able to tell you for sure what an OT would schedule, but sometimes OTs might decide that they're going to break up their minutes, and many other staff would do this too. I am going to see you during this activity this week, but I might see you during this other activity the next week. Or they might say, I'm going to see you for 30 minutes today and 20 minutes tomorrow. So they might break up those minutes as they see fit. So again, the occupational therapy example, just say, may be broken down into multiple sessions based on the instructional needs of the student.
All right. And then finally, the last section here is the program modifications and supports for school personnel. So this is the services and activities for school personnel in order to meet the needs of the student. And so you see the examples on here. And Maria.
So one of the examples that I had on here is just staff training, health and medical. So that might be one. Another example might be, I've seen on many IEPs is TVI might have an in-service with your teachers. So at the beginning of the year, your TVI might have a meeting with all of the new teachers for your student that year, just to tell them this is how the student's vision is working for them right now, and this is what they need to be successful in the classroom. They also might be providing training on support systems or equipment that the student might need throughout the day. Or communicating with each other. That's an important resource. Just the staff communicating with each other on a monthly basis, maybe by email, maybe by phone.
Yep. all really important. So the bottom line in this section, parents that are on here, is just really making sure that you understand how each one of these services and supports are being provided to your child or for your child on behalf of your child. And just if you don't understand or it doesn't make sense, don't be afraid to ask, and ask someone to explain to me what this looks like, or if maybe something doesn't make sense at all. We're going to move on to student participation in the general education environment. So whether the student, it has to be noted on here on the IEP, whether the student will participate full-time with non-disabled peers in general ed or not. The IEP will summarize when and why the student will be removed from non-disabled peers. And then the second part here is we actually discuss whether or not the student will participate in the general physical education class or participate in a specially designed Phy-Ed class instead.
And when your student, so special ed can be provided for students that are 3 to 21. So after age 18, there is a box on there that they wouldn't necessarily need to be in Phy-Ed. They might still be, but that box would be checked NA. But a student who is getting specially designed physical education would have a goal and minutes that would be related to that service that they're getting. But a lot of times a student might be able to be in the general Phy-Ed class, but then have a supplementary aid service that's providing an accommodation in that class.
Correct. Yep, that's good. Yeah, very common. Here we talk about district-wide and state assessments. So it is expected that all students with disabilities will participate in all general, state, and district-wide assessments. The team, the IEP team, identifies the accommodations that the student will utilize for all those assessments. And if the student does not participate in general education curriculum or aligned curriculum, participation in the alternative assessment may be considered. And we've got lots of pages of assessment in here.
There are. So again, this is just an example, and what I tried to put in this IEP was just everything that you might see. So a student would not take this many tests in 1 year ever, because all of them are listed in here. So this first form that's listed in here is the I-7A. So if the student is taking alternate assessments, this form is describing why, and the team has to be notified and they have to talk about it. So all those boxes must say yes. And so those aren't usually all checked yes until after you've had that discussion at the meeting. Some of the information might be there, but you don't want to check that box until you've all talked about it. The next one would be the access test. That's for English language learners. So anyone who is taking that test. And then the next one would be the ACT, which is only taken when you're in junior or 11th grade. The next one that's listed in here is the ACT Aspire. That would be in an IEP for a 9th or a 10th grader. And then the district-wide assessment page, that's, so if we're looking at this sample, it's on page 23. So district-wide assessments, that we'll talk about the civics exam that's required for all high school students. And then anytime a student is taking maybe a STAR test or an NWEA test, that would be described on there as well. And then any accommodations, all these forms would talk about the accommodations that they would use. So then the next one is dynamic learning maps. So dynamic learning maps is that alternate assessment. And then the last one that we have in here is the forward test. So when I'm talking about the accommodations, that might be based on student need. So an example that on that forward one, I put that they would do a Braille test and a scribe. So a scribe, they would have their Braille materials, and a scribe is the person who writes down the answer for them. So if I was giving an Aspire test or an ACT test to a student who's a Braille reader, I would be writing in the bubbles. So that's what a scribe is. Most times students who are reading large print or Braille or audio get extended time, usually a separate setting. So all of those are based on need. So depending on how your student is accessing that test would determine what those accommodations are.
And accommodations are set by the tests, right? So even though your child may get accommodations during their school day, their regular school day, those accommodations may not be available for a test, correct?
Sometimes it depends on the test and depends on what they are. Accommodations are approved by the test. ACT is the one that has to have documentation. So when your student is an 11th grader, you'll be asked to sign a form that says we agree to let you share the IEP with the ACT people, because they need to look at it and verify, yes, your student has a visual impairment. Yes, they need these accommodations. But yes, they are aligned by the tests themselves, but most of the accommodations you would find in a classroom for a test would be ones that you could ask for. Again, separate setting. There's no prompting. You can't prompt or give answers, that kind of thing. So those same kind of general rules would apply.
Great. Thanks, Maria. All right. We do have one slide on transition here. And so this is when a student is turning 14. So if they're 13 and turning 14 during the IEP year, we have to write a post-secondary transition plan into the IEP. So not only do you have an IEP, now you have a PTP. And so this is a whole nother training, but we do additional assessments and student input and parent input in regard to identifying long-term student goals. So that those would be goals for after high school. After high school, the student will attend a training program like Project Search. After high school, the student will have a job as a veterinary tech. After high school, the student will live on their own. So we develop those long-term goals in this other plan, and at least one IEP goal that we're working on in the student's current IEP needs to be linked to getting the student, moving the student to those post-secondary transition plan goals.
And I would have liked to include a sample of the PTP. However, that is not in Infinite Campus. That is a completely separate form that's filled out through the Department of Instruction. And so that is something that is specific to each student. And so those, like you said, are also reviewed annually.
And David Ballman is the guy to talk to about this through the outreach, WCBVI outreach. Okay, so the last item I have here is we've developed this whole IEP now. We do have step 5, which is monitoring progress, which is continuous. We're always analyzing the student's progress toward the IEP goal attainment. They analyze what works and what could be improved. And then when the student is not making sufficient progress, the IEP team really should get back together again. We should be reviewing the IEP. We should be revising it as appropriate. And progress must be reviewed again periodically and reported to parents. And the IEP must be reviewed at least annually.
Cheri, Dave Hyde made a point, good point. Remember that a DVR rep should be asked to attend for students of transition age.
Correct. Oh, good point. Thank you. Yes, definitely. So when we were talking about transition, definitely that's where, when we talked about members of the IEP team at the very beginning of this presentation, and we talked about transition agencies, Dave's exactly right. That Division of Vocational Rehabilitation would be one of those agency reps that would be showing up at IEP meetings. So thanks, Dave. All right. So, so monitoring progress. I do have the Andrew F. talking points worksheet that's linked in here that is all about helping parents prepare for that next IEP. So the next IEP meeting that we're going to have, we always ask parents to take a look at your son or daughter's current IEP, review it, look at the progress reports that you've gotten from the school, and start taking some notes and thinking about, so from your perspective, what's working and what's not? What could be improved? What are you concerned about? And so the Andrew F. Talking Points worksheet is really a cool resource for families to use. And then as we get to the end here, so this slide specifically talks about that changes in an IEP meeting, in an IEP, can occur without actually bringing everybody together. So, and this was a change in the law when it was reauthorized that allows the IEP to be more fluid and more responsive to as things change. So there might be a change of sorts that occurs. The student, something may have occurred, and maybe it's just the parent, the special ed teacher that are talking, saying, you know, I think we need to maybe add another, well, I'll give you an example of what happened when my son was going in school, that he had speech and language 2 days a week, and his speech teacher contacted me and said, you know, Eric's just not making a whole lot of progress, and I'd like to add another 30-minute session. And he said, and I've already got time allocated, and would you be okay with that? And so Eric's speech teacher and myself had the conversation over the phone, and then we met in person, because then I wanted to just see some of the data that he had collected and things like that, because it had been since the last report card. And then we made a change to the IEP. So it was just him and I making that change, letting the lead teacher, the case manager, know. And so, as it says, no parent signature is required. The parent is involved in that conversation. So an IEP can't be changed without talking to that parent, okay? I agreed to the changes. So they revised the IEP, they informed the other staff, and it was taken care of. There's an IEP form, Form I-10, that school staff send out, they fill it out, and they write it out and make the notes of the changes to the IEP that have occurred. But you still get a revised IEP that shows this is the current IEP based on those changes. Just know that change of placement requires the IEP team to all come together and talk. And the IEP team must meet at least once a year. So you always have to have that annual IEP meeting. And so you're required to meet as a team all together at least once a year. But to change things up during the year, to make little changes to an IEP, you can do that without getting all 8, 10, 12 people, all their schedules coordinated and bringing them all together.
There's just a couple things I just wanted to add about the IEP. So the sample IEP that you had, there was 2 other pages that would be at the end.
Yes.
That's okay. So
Sorry.
that's okay. So one of them was extended school year. So extended school year would be programming that your student might need over the summer or over an extended break. And that is usually done after there's been the student has shown some signs of regression. So after a break, if their reading comprehension just drops considerably after summer, and so maybe they want to work on that, or they're working on learning Braille and they've learned the alphabet and they're doing really well, but then they come back at the beginning of the year and you've lost a bunch. So most of the time it is due to regression, and there has to be documentation of that, and then those services would be provided and talked about. Another one would be critical stage, and so that's when if maybe a student has had one placement and they've just moved and they have, now they need to get reacquainted with a new community, and so the critical stage ESY would be something they might qualify for, and then the team would talk about what services they would utilize over the summer. And then the last page that's there is just the placement page, and so that placement page, you wouldn't have a placement page in a draft IEP typically. The only reason it's in here is just so you could have that example. But it's really important that at your meeting you talk about all of the placement options. You're starting at that general ed. That's, that general education classroom. But there are other options, if you're talking about split placements, if you're talking about a residential school such as WSPEI, or even if someone was close enough to be a day student, those things are all options. There's short courses through outreach. So sometimes you might have a student who's participating the whole year at their district school, but maybe for 1 week, they're going to come and they're going to do some intense instruction on one area with an outreach short course. So there's a lot of options that you should talk about each time. Every time you're having that, you want to document those. And while your IEP is an annual IEP and your IEP should be met every year, a lot of districts will start scheduling the month before your IEP is due, just because that way you have time to review that paperwork. So if your IEP goes through like this one, I'm looking at it. I don't see my end date right now. It looks different. I look at it a lot on the computer screen. So, but if your IEP right now, this IEP would end on 5/6 of 2022. So it would end the day before the meeting that you just had. So even though the IEP wouldn't start until 5/28, it's going to end that day before the meeting. And so that team is probably going to start contacting you middle February, March, maybe. They're going to want to set up a meeting probably in April, because especially with spring break, because they want to make sure that they have enough time to complete the paperwork, meet with you, make sure everything agrees, then clean up the paperwork. If you've changed anything, send it to you so you can look at it before it gets implemented.
There's a chat in the chat box from Julie Piper. She had to go, but she said, thank you so much. This would be great for all of her staff to see and understand. Many, many exclamation marks in this chat. Cheri and Maria.
Excellent. That's so cool. And I'm so sorry that we went way over, but yeah, I apologize. I appreciate everyone for staying as long as you are. We're at the end here though. And this is so, so good. I mean, I've learned so much. I appreciate doing this with Maria and learning. and because this is so, so good. I really, really appreciate it. So reaching agreement, we don't all always get along, or we don't always agree, I guess. We get along, but we don't always agree. And so this just points out the importance of trying to reach consensus, but sometimes we don't. And if we don't, rescheduling an IEP meeting sometimes will help to maybe work through maybe some of the sticking points. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't, just know that we have the mediation system, which helps us with facilitated IEP meetings. So that's where a mediator comes in and helps everybody talk and listen to one another. And then mediation is when there's a big, huge issue and we're at an impasse. and it's only a couple of representatives from the parent side and the school side, and you may mediate an issue. So, and out of that, that's a confidential agreement. So there's a lot more involved in that, but just know that's free. Both of these are free. IDEA complaint, if the school is doing something wrong, parents have the right to file an IDEA complaint if they feel that the law is not being followed. Due process hearing, that's litigation. We want to really try to avoid that as much as possible. And then there's a resolution session. Before you actually go to due process, you're encouraged to go to resolution, which is essentially a mediation session, to try to resolve the issue without having to go to due process. So that's reaching agreement. And then finally getting ready. If it's your first IEP meeting, talk to others who understand the process, reach out to parents who have been there before, contact Wisconsin Facets or a WSPEI coordinator. We're here to help and to walk parents through the process. Fill out the student snapshot. So that's an input form that'll help you kind of get yourself ready as a parent, ready to participate, but also ready that you've already thought about your child, thought about maybe some goals, thought about some talking points, okay? Because it's hard sometimes with all the emotions running through your system to think about, oh gosh, I was going to say something and now I can't remember because I just heard this about my child, and it just washes everything out of your brain, right? I've been there and it's hard. So having it written out ahead of time really helps. Reviewing the IEP, we talked about that. Writing down your questions so you don't forget, and think about having positive conversations with your child's teacher before the IEP. I always did that, and it shortened up our IEP meetings because I talked through some of the things that I had concerns or questions about, and then I didn't have to bring it before the whole team. And I actually got a lot of things kind of settled, and made my requests and ideas known ahead of time as well. And then here's a whole bunch of resources, different websites with lots of different types of information for parents as well as educators. There's a whole bunch. And then Rita Fuller is our grant director from the Department of Public Instruction. Caroline Rossing is our statewide grant coordinator. And again, I'm Cheri Sylla from CISA 1.